After his death, the story did not become clearer. It became louder. After Yu Menglong was gone, the narrative surrounding him did not settle into silence. It fractured. What remained was not a single explanation, but a growing accumulation of questions that refused to fade. The official account existed, concise and clinical. Yet beyond it, something else began to take shape. A restless examination of the past. A collective return to moments once dismissed as ordinary. Online spaces transformed into archives of memory. Old interviews resurfaced. Variety shows were replayed. Short clips, once consumed without pause, were slowed down, magnified, and examined frame by frame. Not because anyone claimed they held the truth, but because they no longer felt harmless. Details that once blended into the background now appeared misplaced, unfinished, as if they had been waiting for the wrong moment to be understood. At first, the fragments seemed insignificant. A faint mark on the skin, a fleeting expression, a brief hesitation that lasted less than a second. None of these details could stand on their own. None of them proved anything. But when placed side by side, they began to exert a strange weight. Not the weight of evidence, but the weight of inconsistency. Of things that did not fully align with the image presented. This was not a formal investigation. There were no warrants, no official findings, no definitive claims. What unfolded instead was something quieter and more unsettling. A shared act of rewatching, of noticing what had slipped past attention the first time. Perhaps because it was too subtle. Perhaps because it was too uncomfortable. The discomfort did not come from the details themselves. It came from what they suggested. The possibility that something had been present all along, expressed without words, embedded in gestures and pauses rather than statements. That strain, if it existed, had been carefully managed, packaged as professionalism, absorbed into performance, normalized as part of the industry's unspoken expectations. One of the first points of focus was visual. During a well-known television appearance, viewers noticed a reversed character, briefly visible on his cheek. The image circulated, debated, and eventually dismissed without explanation. Later, attention shifted to another feature. The right side of his face, the boundary between ear and cheek. A dark line that appeared in certain angles, absent in others. Too inconsistent to define, too persistent to ignore. Still, visual ambiguity alone did not ignite widespread unease. Lighting and makeup could explain many things. What could not be explained so easily was a moment captured in an interview. A routine exchange, a familiar set. As Yu Menglong spoke, the female host listening to him suddenly paused. Her expression changed. Her breath caught. She said nothing. The moment passed almost instantly. At the time, it meant nothing. Afterward, it became something else. When viewers returned to that clip, the silence felt louder than words. The pause no longer appeared accidental. It felt displaced, as though it belonged to a different conversation entirely. In an industry built on composure, even a brief lapse carries meaning. Silence is often mistaken for calm. But silence can also be restraint. And when restraint falters, even for a moment, it leaves a trace. And the first crack did not come from him. It came from someone standing right beside him. The first details to attract attention were visual. Not dramatic, not overt. They were the kind of details that normally disappear into the background of broadcast television. A line, a shadow, a feature that appeared in one frame and vanished in another. The sort of inconsistency viewers are trained to ignore. It began with a close-up. The camera moved in tightly, compressing distance, leaving no space for distraction. In that frame, some viewers noticed a faint dark edge along the boundary between the right ear and the cheek. It was subtle. Thin, almost nothing. But once seen, it became difficult to unsee. At first, explanations came easily. Makeup can behave unpredictably under studio lighting. High-definition cameras exaggerate shadows. Angled lights create artificial contours that do not exist in natural conditions. These were reasonable assumptions, common ones. In isolation, the detail did not warrant concern. But the footage did not exist in isolation. As more clips surfaced, people began to compare. The same face, recorded across different programs, different dates, different studios. In some scenes, the right ear appeared perfectly ordinary. In others, the same dark boundary returned, always in roughly the same location, always subtle enough to be dismissed, always visible enough to provoke discomfort. The left side of his face became a point of reference, smooth, even, consistent. When both sides were visible in the same frame, the contrast became harder to ignore. It was not dramatic enough to signal injury, not clear enough to confirm alteration. It existed in an ambiguous space where certainty could not settle. This ambiguity was the problem. Viewers slowed footage down. Screenshots circulated. Circles were drawn. Arrows added. None of it proved anything. But the repetition itself began to matter. A single appearance could be explained away. A pattern, even a weak one, demanded attention. Speculation followed, carefully worded at first. Some suggested a protective patch. Others wondered about a concealed injury. A few raised the possibility of medical intervention, cosmetic or otherwise. These were not accusations. They were attempts to find a framework that made the visual inconsistency feel manageable. No official explanation was ever offered. That absence allowed the speculation to linger, not because the theories were strong, but because silence left room for them to breathe. In an environment where information is tightly controlled, even the smallest unanswered question can grow disproportionate weight. The ear was not the first anomaly people remembered. Earlier, viewers had discussed a reversed character, briefly visible on his cheek during a televised appearance. At the time, it was treated as a curiosity, a trick of reflection, a fleeting visual glitch. No clarification followed, the moment passed. Now viewed alongside the later footage, it gained new relevance, not as proof but as context. Another instance where something appeared without explanation, then disappeared without comment. Alone, it meant little. Together, these moments formed a pattern of omission. What unsettled people was not the idea that something had gone wrong physically. It was the realization that no one had addressed it at all. That whatever these details represented, they had been allowed to exist without acknowledgement, neither confirmed nor denied, simply left behind. As attention intensified, viewers began to examine expressions rather than features. Even when he smiled, there appeared to be tension at the corners of his mouth. The jaw seemed set, as though holding something back. These observations were subjective, easily influenced by hindsight. People knew this. They acknowledged it openly. Still, the feeling persisted. When images are revisited after a tragedy, meaning shifts. Gestures once read as neutrality begin to feel guarded. A neutral expression becomes evasive. A professional smile becomes an act of control. This does not mean the interpretation is correct. It means perception has changed. What mattered was how consistently this perception emerged across different viewers, independently reaching similar conclusions without coordination. They were not searching for guilt. They were searching for coherence. The question was no longer whether the mark on the ear could be explained. It was why it had never been explained, why no clarification had followed, why the visual inconsistencies had been allowed to remain unresolved in a public image built on precision and polish. In entertainment, bodies are carefully managed. Appearances are curated. Deviations are corrected or concealed. When something escapes that process, it stands out not because it is dramatic, but because it is anomalous. This was the space the discussion occupied. Not accusation, not certainty. A quiet awareness that something had slipped through the cracks of control. And when people realized that these physical details were not isolated, that they existed alongside unusual expressions, unaddressed symbols, and later, troubling words, the discomfort deepened. The marks on the body became more than visual anomalies. They became potential signals. Signals do not need to be intentional to be meaningful. Sometimes they are simply what remains when restraint begins to fail. By the time viewers reached this point in their re-examination, one conclusion had quietly formed. Whatever the explanation, it was incomplete. And incomplete stories have a way of pulling attention forward, toward the next unanswered moment. And then people notice something even harder to explain than a mark on the skin, an expression that did not belong to the moment. The moment that unsettled viewers the most did not involve a visible mark or a frame that could be magnified. It involved something far less tangible, a pause, a shift in posture, a silence that interrupted the expected rhythm of an interview. The setting was familiar, a studio environment designed to feel relaxed and controlled. The conversation followed a predictable flow. Light questions, rehearsed answers, a tone calibrated for public comfort. Nothing about it suggested tension, until suddenly it did. As Yu Menglong spoke, the female host listening to him froze. Not dramatically, not long enough to disrupt the broadcast, but long enough to register. Her eyes widened slightly. Her breathing changed. The warmth in her voice faltered. For a brief moment she said nothing. Then the conversation continued. At the time of airing, the pause passed unnoticed. It blended into the natural imperfections of live interaction. Interviews are not machines. People hesitate. Emotions surface. Minor lapses happen. There was no reason to isolate that second from the rest of the footage. That reason only emerged later. When viewers returned to the clip after his death, the pause felt displaced. It no longer belonged to the conversation it interrupted. It felt as though the host had reacted not to what was being said, but to something beneath it, something unspoken, something that did not align with the tone of the exchange. Speculation followed, but it was cautious. Some suggested she had misheard him. Others believed she had been distracted by a cue or a technical issue. These explanations were plausible. None could be proven. None could be disproven. What made the moment difficult to dismiss was not the pause itself, but its quality. The suddenness of the emotional shift, the way composure gave way to restraint, the way her reactions seemed to be actively suppressed rather than absent. In broadcast environments, hosts are trained to recover instantly, to mask confusion, to regulate emotional response. When that regulation slips, even briefly, it becomes noticeable. Not because it is dramatic, but because it contradicts training. Viewers began comparing this clip to other interviews. The same host, the same format, similar questions. In those, her demeanor remained steady, professional, unbroken. The contrast sharpened the anomaly. As attention grew, the moment became a focal point. Not because it explained anything, but because it connected to other unresolved details. The unexplained visual marks, the tense expressions, the lack of clarification. Together, they created a sense of misalignment, a feeling that the surface narrative was intact, while something beneath it remained unstable. This discomfort extended beyond the individuals on screen. It touched on a broader understanding of the entertainment industry itself, an environment where silence is not merely absence of speech, but a skill, where boundaries exist without being named, where certain topics are avoided, not because they are forbidden, but because everyone understands the consequences of addressing them. Artists learn this early. So do hosts. So do producers. There are questions that are safe, and questions that are not. There are emotions that can be displayed, and others that must be contained. These rules are rarely written down. They are transmitted through observation, through what happens to those who cross them. Within this context, the host's reaction took on a different meaning, not as evidence of wrongdoing, but as a human response momentarily escaping structure, a reaction that surfaced before restraint could fully reassert itself. Silence, in this sense, is not neutral. It is active. It maintains equilibrium. It protects systems, but it also accumulates pressure. And pressure, when released unexpectedly, leaves traces. Viewers described the moment in similar terms, even when they had not discussed it with one another. They spoke of discomfort, of a sense that something did not belong, of an interruption that felt emotional rather than technical. These descriptions varied in language but not in tone. The reaction became a point of return. Each time new details surfaced, people went back to that clip, rewatching the pause, examining her expression, asking the same question repeatedly. Why then? Why there? In isolation, the moment meant nothing. But isolation was no longer possible. Too many fragments had already converged. The host's silence no longer stood alone. It echoed against other silences, against missing explanations, against unanswered questions. In industries governed by image, silence is often interpreted as stability, a sign that nothing is wrong. But silence can also indicate constraint, the effort required to keep something contained. And when that effort falters, even briefly, it suggests the presence of force. This realization did not lead to certainty. It led to recognition. Recognition that the story unfolding was not one of overt revelation, but of subtle failure. Small moments where control loosened, where something nearly surfaced. The pause in the interview did not reveal a secret. It revealed a boundary. Silence protects systems. But sometimes it also exposes them. The discussion shifted direction when a new fragment entered circulation. Not a video, not an expression captured on camera. This time it was a screenshot. Its origin was unclear. Its authenticity unverified. No official source confirmed it. No metadata established its date beyond speculation. Under ordinary circumstances, it might have been dismissed immediately. But context had already altered the way people perceived information surrounding Yu Menglong. Doubt no longer led to silence. It led to scrutiny. The message, allegedly written by him, described a situation that felt out of proportion with the public image he maintained. It spoke of contracts renewed against his will, of refusal met with threats, of financial resources stripped away, of control extending beyond professional boundaries into personal survival. If the words were genuine, they were not complaints. They were alarms. What unsettled readers was not only the content, but the tone. There was no performance in the language, no attempt to dramatize. The sentences were direct, heavy, practical. Fear expressed not through exaggeration, but through matter-of-fact statements. The kind written when there is no audience to impress. Skepticism followed immediately. Many questioned why such a message would surface only after his death. Others pointed out the ease with which screenshots can be fabricated. These doubts were valid. They were necessary. The conversation acknowledged them openly. Still, the screenshot persisted. Its persistence had less to do with proof than with resonance. The themes it raised did not appear in isolation. Years earlier, Yu Menglong had spoken cautiously about contracts signed without full awareness, about fear of being controlled. At the time, those comments passed without consequence. They were framed as industry frustration, nothing more. When placed beside the alleged message, those earlier remarks acquired new weight, not because they confirmed anything, but because they echoed control, fear, lack of agency. The repetition unsettled people. Patterns, even unproven ones, draw attention when they repeat across time. One line in the screenshot proved particularly difficult to ignore. The suggestion of physical harm if compliance was refused. That single implication shifted the conversation. Contractual disputes are common. Power imbalances are expected. Threats cross a different boundary. Again, there was no confirmation, no corroborating evidence. But the question that emerged was not whether the message was true. It was why the idea it presented felt plausible to so many people so quickly. In the entertainment industry, control often operates quietly. Decisions are framed as guidance, restrictions as protection, pressure as opportunity. Artists are encouraged to trust systems they did not design and cannot see in full. Most comply. Some resist. The consequences of resistance are rarely discussed publicly. Within this framework, the screenshot became symbolic, not of a specific accusation, but of a broader fear artists rarely articulate. The fear of losing ownership over one's own life, of becoming a function rather than a person, of being managed beyond the stage. Viewers did not treat the screenshot as evidence. They treated it as context, one more fragment added to an already fragmented picture. Visual anomalies, emotional lapses, unaddressed questions. Now written words suggesting desperation. Each piece alone was insufficient. Together they created a narrative of pressure. The most painful question raised by the message was not about perpetrators or motives. It was about isolation. If the words were real, why was there no intervention? Why no pause? Why no visible shift in the machinery surrounding him? If the words were false, the question remained. Why did so many people find them believable? By this point, the conversation had moved beyond specific details. It had become reflective. People began asking whether Yu Menglong had ever truly exercised control over his own trajectory, whether decisions attributed to him were genuinely his, whether compliance had been mistaken for consent. These questions had no answers. They were not meant to. They existed in the space left behind by absence. Absence of clarification, absence of transparency, absence of dialogue. As the fragments accumulated, one realization grew quietly unavoidable. Whatever the truth, it was no longer accessible in full. The person who could confirm or deny these interpretations was gone. What remained were traces, partial signals, unfinished expressions. The screenshot did not reveal a secret. It intensified a silence. By the time these questions began circulating widely, Yu Menglong was no longer present to contextualize his own words, expressions, or silences. The conversation had become one-sided. Interpretation replaced dialogue. And that was the most unsettling aspect of all. By the time people started asking these questions, he was no longer here to answer them. What remained after the fragments were laid side by side was not clarity. It was weight, a heaviness created not by any single detail, but by their accumulation. Visual inconsistencies, pauses that felt misplaced, words that surfaced too late. None of them proved anything. Yet none of them could be comfortably dismissed. Together they formed a landscape of absence. The official explanation surrounding Yu Menglong's death was concise. It addressed the event, not the context. It closed the case without opening the conversation. In doing so, it left behind a void. And into that void the fragments flowed. Not because people wanted to accuse, but because silence demanded to be filled. As viewers revisited the past, the meaning of familiar images shifted. A neutral expression became guarded. A professional smile appeared strained. A brief hesitation felt deliberate. This shift did not indicate truth. It revealed perspective. When outcomes change, interpretation follows. What troubled people most was not the possibility of hidden wrongdoing. It was the realization that if distress had existed, it had been invisible by design. Managed, absorbed, normalized. The machinery surrounding public figures is built to preserve continuity. Disruption is costly, silence is efficient. Within that system, signals do not announce themselves loudly. They emerge quietly, in inconsistencies, in moments where control briefly loosens, in reactions that slip past training before restraint returns. These moments do not declare intent, they merely exist. The story that unfolded around Yu Menglong was not one of revelation. It was one of recognition. Recognition that the public often sees only what is permitted to be seen. That discomfort, when it appears, is often edited out or reframed. That the absence of explanation does not mean the absence of strain. The fragments left behind were incomplete, disjointed, open to interpretation. But they shared a common trait. They suggested pressure. Pressure without language. Pressure without resolution. What people grieved was not certainty. It was timing. Only after he was gone did the rewatching begin. Only then did the pauses feel heavy. Only then did the marks draw attention. Only then did the words resonate. The realization that something might have been communicated without words arrived too late to change anything. This does not transform speculation into truth. It does not turn suspicion into proof, but it reframes the silence. It forces a reconsideration of what is often overlooked in lives conducted under constant observation. Sometimes, the most revealing details are not hidden. They are visible, but inconvenient. Too subtle to interrupt momentum. Too uncomfortable to address. Left untouched because acknowledging them would require slowing down. Yu Menglong left behind no final explanation. No definitive statement. What remains are traces. Not answers, but reminders. That composure can coexist with strain. That silence can signal containment rather than calm. That control, when unexamined, can obscure distress. There may never be a conclusion that satisfies everyone. The fragments may remain fragments, but they continue to matter, not because they solve a mystery, but because they insist on being seen. Because sometimes the truth is not announced, it is present all along, waiting to be taken seriously. And sometimes it is ignored for far too long.